Hi guys, Mark here, MMR Trains and More. Hey, thanks for stopping by again this morning. Got a kind of a self-indulgent video, I suppose, this time around. It's my birthday week, so I thought, well, instead of doing an update on the layout and a bunch of modeling shots and that, I thought maybe I would look back at my first layout, layout on my own, I suppose you would say. And of course, two of the guys that influenced me back then and still are doing so today. So this will be a little bit different than normal, but I did start on the sanding tower, as you see here, and it's coming along nicely. So I'll have a little bit of an explanation about that model next week, hopefully. And I did reshoot, thanks to one of our members, subscribers here on the channel, Hey Beer Dan. He's 100% right. Ramming speed on that last video going into the new northern elevator. I'm afraid in real life I would have taken half of the darn thing out. So sometimes not always easy to shoot and run trains at the same time. Kind of a one-man operation here when it comes to that. So hey, I should have just axed that footage anyways at the end of that last video, but here it is a little better again. And there you go. While in high school, I was, like most of us, a reader of all the magazines back in the day, and Model Railroader was one of my favorites, just because of the personalities in it. Anyways, one of the guys, kind of a young guy coming up in Kalmbach at the time, was Rick Johnson. And I would go on later in life, of course, to work with him and meet him, in person through the Sioux Line Historical and Technical Society. The layout he designed was based on the Sioux Line, which I had an interest in, a little more modern than I cared for. He was modeling at that time current day, late 70s, early 80s. So his dad worked for the railroad, the Sioux Line, so naturally he had an interest in it as well from that end of it. I moved out into my own home in the early 90s, and by 1994 I was ready to start building a layout in this new house of mine. I had previously lived at home and had a good relationship with my parents, so just bankrolling money to buy a home. The layout was designed for a basement where the steps, I always felt, would come down into the middle of the room. The whole concept was sort of around the walls, but again, kind of dating the layout a bit. Didn't really feature a helix or multi-deck. This was a layout that had a lot of hidden trackage, and it stretched out the main line with that trackage, but it was a lot of possible problems with all this hidden trackage. Now I would go on to build this. Of course, I didn't have quite the room size that Rick had drawn the plan for. So even though it was about 25 in length, it only wound up being at about 12 to 14 foot in width at some point in my room. And the staging area, which he had drawn kind of in the same room for my situation, wound up in a different room. I actually took a brick out from one of the walls and pushed the track through that into the next room. The layout was fun. I learned a lot of scenery techniques on it that I still use today on my current layout. And of course, operating. I started getting to operations at the time. Everything was kind of handwritten yet on switch lists. But there were about 200 cars on that layout, and it would take a couple days for me to figure out what I wanted to spot where, and car card basically situation. But the operators never touched the cards. I kind of controlled all of that back in my office. So they just got a switch list, and that's something I wanted to stick with. I still stick with today. Like I said, Rick and I got to know each other a little better through the Sioux Line Society. He was a graphic illustrator, and super with all the computers as they came on. Learned everything from the ground floor up, and He helped our society out immensely with drawings, and now, of course, he's happily retired, and I haven't caught up with him for a couple years now, but hopefully he's still interested in the hobby. I know he's helped me out quite a bit with drawings for the magazine that I now edit, even though it's a passion of mine to keep the printed magazine going, as from my background, of course. There's a skill to it, and Rick was one of the best. The other guy that came along in my life at the time, a fellow by the name of John Propsting, I always call him John Prepsting. He lived down in Illinois, and he was actually a fellow that became the president of the Sioux Line Historical and Technical Society. John was a fanatical photographer. He loved doing prototype modeling. He tried to match it right to his time of modeling, which was basically like 1948. I kind of became aware of John through another Kalmbach book, the Great Model Railroad book. It just kind of furthered my desire to go see this thing in person, which I eventually did. And the nicest guy in the world would share all of his information. The layout, as you see from the plan here, it's again, it did have a helix. The helix that he used, of course, ran down to a staging yard. The area he modeled was a little more, I suppose, the west end of what I was interested in. Overall, the era and the look of that railroad really inspired me, and I liked the fact that it was mainly a single deck railroad, which at the time already was sort of, I wouldn't say falling out of favor, but there were a lot of people that were going into this double deck modern long mainline run type of layout. John's was an entirely different setup in that he wanted to model the big yard at Stevens Point and then have staging for the other areas on the railroad. And we shared a lot of the common interests in not only era, but the locations that we wanted to model. There was a lot of overlap in our desire to model Neenah Yard. He had the Neenah Roundhouse, in fact, modeled at that time. And that would come back later on as well, ironically, through Rick. John never really did live to see the entire dream become a reality in his basement because John suffered an aneurysm, which did him in. He passed away. The Neenah Roundhouse circled all the way back to me, even though I was, just a shirt-tail friend of his at the very end of his life, unfortunately. The Roundhouse wound up going to the Sioux Line Society and wound up somehow in Rick Johnson's hands. And at this time, Rick was moving. He was getting out of his house. He really didn't have a layout. One thing led to another, and the late Larry Easton, who ran our archives and certainly was interested in other railroads too. Anyways, I think he put the arm on Rick and told him about my layout. And since Larry and I were good friends through our Model Railroad NMRA division here, hey, why not bring that roundhouse back here if you're not going to use it? And I know someone that can. And well, at the time, Rick said no problem, and certainly appreciate that. Anyways, John's fine-looking Neenah Roundhouse, after some cleaning and a little bit of putting some of the details back on it, wound up here on the Stevens Point division, and to this day serves the layout, Neenah Yard, and great point of interest on my layout. If we could go back to the picture of John and his crew, the back row is quite notable for guys that are still with us, active in the hobby, and very well known, frankly. From left, David Popp, who now works for Fire Crown, the kind of the new owners of Model Railroader, of course, and other titles. And he's quite active with a Midday Modeler podcast for Fire Crown. And it's kind of interesting to watch him work on the layout that they're building. And so you can check that out on YouTube. The fellow in the center is Mike Paulsgrove. Mike runs a 3D printing operation. He now doesn't live in Illinois anymore. He lives down in Florida. Nice warm weather. And Sue Parts, it's Northwoods Models. The other fella on the right, David Leiter, now the president of the Soo Line Society, and a fine modeler in his own right, and quite an author. So John's legacy lives on, I suppose, as well through these three guys. If you take anything from this birthday video, I suppose, it's how important our friends are in the hobby. And, you know, it's kind of a network of modelers. We stick together online, and we learn from each other that way as well. So anyways, that's our little take on birthday week. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next week with a little more modeling. Now, if you would be so kind to subscribe to my channel, I'd appreciate it. Thank you for tuning in today, and we'll see you down the rails.